This is United States History 202, Presentation 8, Gilded Age Political History. So in this particular presentation, we're going to go through some of the political issues that are up in this period of time, the late 19th century. We'll talk about presidential politics, and we'll look at some of the major issues confronting the United States at this period of time. Now, a lot of people consider this to be a wasteland of American politics. Historians generally have ignored this period, but I think it's one of the more important periods in American history, and there are a lot of parallels to be drawn between the late 19th century and our modern political scene. So you're going to see that the issues we'll talk about at the end of this presentation are in many ways contemporary issues. So first and foremost, let's look at the presidential line of succession from 1877 to 1901. Again, these people are not household names, but you do have a couple of interesting things here. First of all, you have the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. That would be Grover Cleveland. We'll talk about him. You have the centennial president, Benjamin Harrison, who was the president 100 years after George Washington. And you have 2 presidential assassinations. Both Garfield and McKinley were killed while in office. So this is a very violent period as well, as we'll see as we go through the presentation. Now, the first president in office is Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio. He's a Republican, a war hero. We talked about him in the 1876 presidential election and how he wins over Samuel Tilden. He's in office from 1877 to 1881. And we basically already looked at the major issues of the Hayes administration. We talked about the end of Reconstruction in Presentation 2. We talked about the Indian Wars in Presentation 5. And we'll get to the economic problems later. The interesting thing about Hayes is not the administration itself, though the economic problems are interesting, but what happens in 1880. 1880, of course, is a election year, and Hayes was not going to be renominated. And it's really interesting. U.S. Grant actually thought about coming out of retirement and serving a 3rd term, but the Republican Party was fairly divided at this point. And so a outsider in so many ways, James Garfield, a guy that was really not even involved in the conversation as the 1880 Republican convention rolled around, is then nominated by the Republican convention by a slim majority. Now, the reason he was nominated, as you can see on this political cartoon, he was known for his honesty, his ability, and his patriotism. The question is, how honest was he? He was actually involved in the Credit Mobilier, or Credit Mobilier scandal. Acquitted, but regardless, he was involved in this thing. So how honest was a guy that was involved in that much corruption? He would be opposed in 1880 by Winfield Scott Hancock, a war hero, a Democrat, but a conservative Democrat, more of a Johnson Democrat. He had a great reputation, primarily because of his activities during the war between the states. He was a great participant in that struggle for the North, and but he was liked by the South because of his politics. Now, the 1880 election will be the closest popular vote in American history for president. And as you can see on the map, the candidates are only separated by about 10,000 votes. So you can see Garfield is going to win in the Electoral College, but he won't get 50% of the popular vote, and Hancock barely loses in the Electoral College. This is a very close election. So James Garfield was also from Ohio, a moderate Republican, very independent though, and he was a Union War veteran as well. What happens because of this independent streak, this gets into partisan politics, and we'll talk about this in the issues later, but he will be assassinated in 1881 by a disgruntled office seeker named Charles Guiteau. And when Guiteau shoots Garfield in the back, he says, "I am a stalwart of the stalwart, Arthur is president now." And that had a political undertone. So we're going to talk about that when we get to civil service reform. But that should say named, not names, named Charles Guiteau. But this is a major blow to the presidency again, because now, not even 20 years later, Abraham Lincoln was killed in 1865. Now we have James Garfield killed in 1881. Not immediately. He's shot in the back. An interesting story. He doesn't die from that. He actually lives about another month. He's paralyzed from the waist down. They take him to the beach because they think the salt air will do him some good. And the doctors are continually probing for the bullet. And he catches infection because these men are not wearing gloves. And in fact, in one case, one of the doctors pierces his liver with his finger. They're just sticking their fingers in the wounds trying to find the bullet. So this is how Garfield dies. There he is being shot. So he's succeeded by Chester Arthur, Vermont/New York. So he will be in office from 1881 to 1885. Arthur was known as a dandy. What do I mean by that? Well, the guy liked to perfume his whiskers. He liked to be well appointed and dressed. But he was very liked, a well-liked individual. It was kind of like, Arthur walked in the room, everyone would say his name, "Hey, Chet," So Arthur was a very popular individual, but he was also a very partisan individual. So when Chester Arthur became president, people were afraid that the presidency would be much more partisan. But actually, Arthur had a relatively open presidency, and in fact, he pushed for civil service reform, which we'll talk about a little later. One thing about Arthur, too, is when he came into the White House in 1881, it had been almost 20 years since it had been redecorated. So Arthur set out to redecorate the White House and threw a lot of the stuff out on the lawn for just throw it in the trash. And this got rid of a lot of interesting artifacts. But so he was this kind of individual. He liked interior decoration and was well appointed. So that's why he was called a dandy. Now, the 1884 election is interesting. Chester Arthur will file too late to make a serious run at the nomination, so the Republicans will nominate James G. Blaine of Maine, a former radical Republican, but a half-breed. So he, and again, we'll talk about this as civil service reform. So you had the Republicans that were stalwarts; they believed in the patronage system. Then you had half-breeds, which did not believe necessarily in the patronage system. So we'll talk about that. But he was also very corrupt. His morals were questioned. This guy had a long political history of all kinds of skeletons in the closet. So all this stuff was brought out during the election cycle. The Democrats will nominate Stephen Grover Cleveland of New York, very conservative Democrat, again in the Jefferson-Jackson mold, known for cleaning up corruption in New York as mayor of Buffalo and then later as governor of New York. This is a very dirty campaign, though. But one of the reasons why Cleveland is going to be popular because we've had now several years of corruption it's seen in Washington, D.C. and at the state level. So they want a guy to come in like Cleveland who could clean things up, make things better, and restore the reputation of American politics. Now, I mentioned this is a dirty campaign. What happened is Cleveland, when he was an attorney in New York, worked at a law firm, and there was a woman associated with the law firm who was basically associated with every man in the law firm. The only guy who wasn't married was Grover Cleveland. So when she wound up pregnant, Cleveland claimed the baby. Wasn't his, but he took one for the team, so to speak, and claimed the baby. And so this is discovered during the campaign. And so now Cleveland has an illegitimate child. Well, that was a major scandal back in the 19th century. And so the Blaine people thought they were going to use this to damage his reputation as Grover the Good, this great, honest, upright man. Well, Cleveland just admits to it. He says, yeah, I have a child out of wedlock. And so this anti-Cleveland poster, which said, "Mama, where is my pa?" And then Cleveland camp would respond, "Gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha." So this doesn't have the desired effect in harming Grover Cleveland's reputation. So here's the 1884 election. You can see also very close, 20,000 votes for this one. But Cleveland is going to win this time. So now Cleveland is elected. He's the first Democrat elected president since James Buchanan in 1856. And he is the 22nd president of the United States. He serves this term from 1885 to 1889. Now, Cleveland, again, was a conservative in the Jefferson-Jackson mold. He's going to use the veto as a wrecking ball against unconstitutional legislation. In fact, he issues the most vetoes in American history until Franklin Roosevelt. He believed in a limited central government, sound money, anti-tariff, anti-imperialism, and he was really trying to heal the wounds of Reconstruction. In fact, in 1887, he issued something called the Rebel Flag Order, where he ordered all captured or confiscated Confederate flags returned to the South. This was very unpopular, and in fact, the political pressure was so much he had to repeal this order. But Cleveland had Southerners in his cabinet. This really was a much more national administration than the previous administrations with Republican presidents. Cleveland was also married in the White House. He was 48 at the time. He married 21-year-old Frances Folsom. Frances Folsom was the daughter of Oscar Folsom, and Oscar Folsom was one of the partners in the law firm where Cleveland worked. In fact, the father of the child that Cleveland claimed. So that's kind of an interesting twist to all of this. And so he had the ceremony in the White House, as I said, and Cleveland and Folsom were a very happy couple, apparently. And Cleveland had essentially been courting her since she was in her late teens. But the corrupt politics really set the stage for a contentious 1888 election. The Republicans will nominate Benjamin Harrison. He is the grandson of President William Henry Harrison, the great-grandson of Benjamin Harrison V, signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a Civil War veteran, and he's going to win the 1888 election through corruption, voter fraud. Essentially what happens is he loses the popular vote, but he wins in the Electoral College, and there was a couple of states where the tally came back for Harrison when it probably shouldn't in the Electoral College. So he will be the 23rd President of the United States. He serves one term, 1889 to 1893. He's known as the Centennial President because he serves 100 years after George Washington. And a lot of people made fun of Harrison for this, but in reality, when you look at it, he was from the Harrison family, which was a very prominent American family. One man had been president, another signed the Declaration of Independence. They were from Virginia. So it's not really much of a downgrade there in terms of the family name. But Harrison was continually dogged with charges of corruption and close ties to big business. And so these charges of corruption were too difficult to overcome in 1892. So here's the 88 election. You can see very close. Again, neither candidate gets 50% of the vote, and Harrison gets about, Cleveland gets about 100,000 more popular votes than Harrison, but still loses the election. Well, Cleveland will be renominated by the Democrats in 92. Francis actually told the staff at the White House they would be back, and of course she was correct. So Cleveland will win the 1892 election. He'll become the 24th President of the United States then. And so in many ways, and he serves one term this time, 1893 to 1897. And in many ways, Grover Cleveland is the last conservative president. He had an anti-intervention foreign policy, which we'll talk about in Presentation 11. He modernized the Navy. He believed in sound money, the gold standard. He was against a protective tariff. The thing that harms Cleveland's reputation as a president is the Panic of 1893. The government went into a severe depression caused by the government. We'll talk about this in a few minutes. But Cleveland responded by saying the people's job is to support the government. It's not the government's job to support the people. So this statement has been used by historians for years to show Grover Cleveland as being heartless, a man who's out of touch with modern politics. But constitutionally, he was correct. There is nothing in the Constitution that allows for the government to provide money for people who are struggling for unemployment or anything, food assistance, any of those kind of things. We do it nowadays, but it's not constitutional. And so Cleveland was just following the Constitution at this point. And here's the 92 election. In 1896, the Republicans would nominate William McKinley. They would support the traditional Republican economic agenda, but they would also have an expansionistic foreign policy component. And it's really interesting. 96 is an interesting election. Many liberal Republicans would actually support the Democrats in this election, and many conservative Democrats would bolt the party and support either a third-party candidate, which we'll talk about in the next slide, or McKinley. So you kind of have a shifting of party alliances here. The Republican Party becomes more conservative, at least for this election cycle, and the Democratic Party more liberal. The Democrats will nominate William Jennings Bryan of Illinois. He was 36 years old at the time, the youngest man ever nominated by a major party for president. And what you're seeing is a change in the Democratic Party. It had gone from less Cleveland influence to more of a liberal influence. Bryan supported free silver. He supported a more powerful central government. In fact, he made a very famous speech in the 1896 Democrat convention titled "A Cross of Gold," where he said, farmers are being nailed to a cross of gold. And essentially the image there, of course, Christian imagery. Bryan was a very Christian man. And so this gold was crucifying people, and they needed to have free silver. So what will happen is the conservative Democrats will either support the Republicans who supported a gold standard, or they will support the National Democratic Party, or NDP. This was a conservative, limited government, free trade, gold standard party with Jefferson and Cleveland as their standard bearers. They actually had a very interesting ticket. It was a Union Confederate ticket. Their presidential candidate was a man named John Palmer, who was a Union war veteran, and their vice presidential candidate was a man named Simon Bolivar Buckner, who was a Confederate general during the war. So they were really trying to bridge the gap between North and South in this particular ticket. They didn't poll very well. In some states like Alabama, actually, did okay in Alabama. But you can see McKinley's going to win the election, again, without really any support from the South to the West. And Bryan will pull the South and the West. But it's a pretty handy victory for William McKinley. So McKinley is the 25th President of the United States, serves from 1897 to 1901. Foreign policy will dominate his presidency, which we'll talk about in Presentation 11. And he will be assassinated in 1901 in Buffalo, New York. A man named Leon Czolgosz will walk up to him with his hand in a bandage and a pistol in his hand and point the pistol right in McKinley's stomach and shoot him. So Czolgosz was an anarchist. McKinley wouldn't die immediately. He would die of infection days later, and Czolgosz would then be executed via the electric chair. Now, many people call McKinley, though, the first modern president in the way he used the press corps, the powers of the presidency. So things were changing for the American president, as we're going to see when we get into politics in the next segment for this course. Now, let's talk about some of the major issues very quickly. These four things: civil service reform, the protective tariff, silver, bimetallism, and inflation, and also regulation of business. And, of course, all of this will entail a much more powerful federal government. So first and foremost, civil service reform. This is a major issue after the assassination of Garfield in '81. It played a role in the 1880 election. What you had were two different views on how people should get jobs in the federal government. The first was called the spoils system, whereas if you were the president and you had patronage, you had appointment powers, you would appoint all your buddies to various positions. The other was the merit system. The merit system believed that you hired the best people, regardless of party, but people that you thought would do the best job. The stalwarts, as you know, I mentioned before, with the execution or the assassination, I'd say, of Garfield, the stalwarts believed in the spoils system. The half-breeds believed in the merit system. So what happens is you have these party machines led by people like Roscoe Conkling in New York, who would, when their man was in office, they would submit a list of people for jobs, and those people would all get jobs. Well, this caused the assassination of Garfield when one of these office seekers didn't get a job. And so in 1883, the Congress will pass something called the Pendleton Act, which Chester Arthur would sign into law. And this placed federal jobs under civil service. So now most federal jobs today fall under civil service. The president appoints very few jobs men for executive, in the federal government, and most jobs are hired. This was to take away the spoils system and make it more equitable. The protective tariff is also a big issue. A tariff, of course, is a tax on imports. And you had two different theories as to how the American economy should be run. One was protection, one was competition. Protection would be to protect American industry from foreign competition, and therefore you would keep American jobs and boost American industry. The other was competition, where American companies, if they could compete with foreign companies, would get business. And so many of the Democrats supported competition. Most of the Republicans supported protection. In fact, Cleveland would urge the reduction of a tariff, particularly in his second term, because when he's out of office for that when Benjamin Harrison is president, the Congress will pass something known as the McKinley tariff, which was the highest tariff in American history at 48%. So all imported goods were being taxed at 48%. When Cleveland goes back into the executive mansion in 1893, the next year the Congress will pass something called the Wilson-Gorman tariff, which reduced the tariff down. So his idea on reduction would hold sway while he was president. But this is a back and forth. When the Republicans are in office, usually going to see higher tariffs. When the Democrats are in office at this time, usually lower tariffs. It's kind of flipped in that way today. Now, what about this issue of silver, bimetallism, and inflation? Well, the United States had operated after the Grant administration on something called the gold standard. In essence, all money was backed in gold, but nothing else. Well, beginning in the 1870s, there's a push to have silver also minted as coin for currency. And this is through the Bland-Allison Act of '78. And what this thing does is mandate that the government start minting silver coin, and that the government has so much money in silver. Well, in 1890, the government will pass something called the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890, and now it mandates that the government has the same amount of gold and silver in the Treasury. Well, what happens is they set the ratio of dollars to gold or dollars to silver incorrectly. They don't peg it to the market. They set it artificially, and so you start having gold leave the Treasury and silver fill up the Treasury, and so they're not following the law. They're actually breaking the law. So when Cleveland becomes president again in 1893, he puts the United States back onto the gold standard, which of course causes a depression, a panic. Part of the reason why, though, is because the Republicans had been meddling with this monetary system, and Cleveland simply was following the law, and he rejected this idea of bimetallism, where you have two precious metals and where the ratio is incorrectly set. So when we go back on the gold standard, it causes deflation and a little bit of a panic. Now, another major issue, of course, is regulation of business. The government will get into regulating business. They have been promoting it all through the railroads and land grants and things like that. But in 1887 and 1890, the government will pass two laws, the Interstate Commerce Act and the Sherman Antitrust Act. Both were designed to regulate business. So now they're not only going to be promoting business with one hand, they're going to regulate it with the other. The Interstate Commerce Act changed the relationship between government and business forever. It said that rates, as you're transporting goods, had to be just and reasonable, but they didn't define that. It established the Interstate Commerce Commission, which could act as basically judge, jury, and executioner, all three branches of the federal government. And there's no oversight of this thing, really. Prohibited pooling operations, discriminatory rates, and rebates, but nobody defined these things. So what happened here is the ICC was the first of many federal regulatory agencies, and it definitely violated the free market and the Constitution. But what the government is doing now is trying to regulate interstate commerce, and they're trying to use that as a weapon to get what they want out of their legislation. The second law is the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. This was legislation designed to create competition. It prohibited monopolies, but they didn't define what a monopoly was. Prohibited anyone from conspiring to form a monopoly, but again, didn't define what that was. The result is that no business has been called a trust except banks since 1890. So what it did is it scared businesses into not forming monopolies. But again, what is a monopoly? How much of the market do you have to control to have a monopoly? Nobody really answers this question. And so this is a very vague law, but the result is that people try to stay away from these things. Now, the Supreme Court would have a word about this. In fact, a man named Melville Fuller, the Chief Justice, would write the majority opinion in the case entitled United States versus E.C. Knight and Company in 1897. The Supreme Court at this point ruled that the federal government did not have authority over monopolies. The Supreme Court had opposition to business regulations. So here's the court, the very conservative court, trying to strike down some of the things the Parliament and the President were signing into law at this point. They're trying to serve as a check, but they're not being very effective in the long term. So in summary, is this road the wasteland of American politics? Well, I don't think so. Many important issues are still relevant today. When you look at trade and monetary policy, those are still important issues. You do see the lingering effects of Reconstruction and the war, particularly in the way people vote, North and South. And there was a tremendous amount of political corruption and scandal in this period. So this is not a clean period of American politics by any stretch of the imagination. There's a lot of seedy stuff going on here. Okay, so that's Presentation 8. I will see you next time for Presentation 9.